Zarya stood on the observation deck of her ship, staring out into the vastness of space. The stars twinkled in the distance, each one a tiny beacon in the cold, endless void. She had seen this view many times before, yet it never failed to remind her of the weight she carried on her shoulders. As the princess of the Marvok Empire, every decision she made affected millions of lives. The pressure was always there, like a constant, heavy cloak that never left her. Today was no different. She was on her way to Earth to meet her future husband, an alliance that had been arranged for political gain. Zarya had always known this day would come. Her marriage was not about love. It was about power, stability, and securing the future of her empire. Her betrothed, Lord Arvin, was a noble from a distant planet, one whose family held significant influence in the galaxy. His wealth and power made him an ideal match, and Zarya had never questioned her duty to marry him. But as her ship glided through the stars, Zarya couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that settled in her chest. She had met Lord Arvin only a few times, and while he was handsome and charming, she had never felt any spark between them. He was a man of logic and ambition, much like herself, but there was no passion, no warmth. She had grown up believing that duty came before all else. Love was a luxury, a fleeting emotion that could easily be ignored in the pursuit of power. Still, as the day of her marriage approached, a part of Zarya wished that love could be part of her story. That maybe, just maybe, she could find someone who understood her, someone who would see beyond her royal status and love her for who she truly was. But that was a dream, and dreams were not meant for people like her. As she turned away from the window, Zarya's thoughts were interrupted by the soft hum of footsteps behind her. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The ship's chief engineer, Arik, had entered the observation deck. Arik was nothing like the people she was used to. He was a human, a mechanic who had been assigned to her ship for its maintenance. Zarya had met him several times during her journey, but she had never paid him much attention. Humans were often seen as less significant in the grand scheme of the galaxy, and their roles were typically reserved for tasks that required little skill or intellect. But Arik was different. He wasn't tall or imposing like most of the men she encountered. He was average in height, with a rugged look about him. His features were not the sharp, regal lines that Zarya was accustomed to, but they were kind, warm even. His hair was dark and messy, and his eyes held a quiet intensity, as if he was always observing the world around him, taking it all in. There was something about him that intrigued Zarya, though she couldn't quite place what it was. "Princess," Arik greeted her, his voice low and respectful. "Is everything to your liking?" Zarya nodded absently, her mind still preoccupied with her thoughts. "Yes, thank you, Arik. Everything is fine." She glanced at him, noticing how his gaze lingered on her for just a moment longer than usual. There was something there, something unspoken. But Zarya dismissed the thought, as she often did when it came to humans. They were beneath her, both in status and in importance. They could never truly understand the burdens she carried. Arik shifted on his feet, clearly hesitant. "I've been working on the engine all morning," he said, his tone more casual now. "If you don't mind, I could give you a tour of the lower decks, show you the modifications we've made." Zarya smiled politely, though her interest in the ship's mechanical workings was minimal. Still, she appreciated his offer.
"That sounds nice. Lead the way, Arik."
They walked in silence through the corridors, the soft clank of their footsteps echoing in the quiet ship. Zarya found herself looking at Arik more closely now. He was nothing special by royal standards, but there was a grounded, real quality about him that made her curious. He was hard-working, diligent in his tasks, and never complained, even though he worked long hours in the ship's engine room. As they reached the lower decks, Arik began explaining the various systems he had helped improve, his voice confident but not boastful. Zarya listened more attentively than she had expected. She found herself admiring the way he spoke, the way he seemed to care so much about his work. She was used to people who spoke only of politics, power, and wealth. But Eric spoke of things that mattered to him, things that made him feel alive. It was refreshing, in a way. She hadn't realized how much time had passed until Eric suddenly stopped and turned to face her. "Princess," he said softly, his expression serious. "I know that our roles are different, and that you have your duties to the Empire."
But I just wanted to say, I'm grateful for your leadership.
You've done more for the galaxy than anyone realizes. Zarya blinked in surprise.
She hadn't expected such words from someone like him. "Thank you, Arik," she replied, unsure of how to respond. She had never been one to receive compliments, especially not for her leadership. "But it's my duty!" Eric looked at her, his eyes softening. "I know, but that doesn't make it any easier." Sometimes it's easy to forget that even the strongest leaders are human. Or alien. He chuckled awkwardly, realizing what he had said. Zarya felt a strange flutter in her chest. It was a feeling she couldn't quite understand, but it made her uncomfortable. She didn't want to acknowledge it, so she quickly changed the subject. "Is the ship ready for the journey to Earth?" she asked, hoping to steer the conversation in a more familiar direction. Eric nodded. "Yes, we're ready. I'll make sure everything is in order before we leave." He hesitated again, glancing at her with a mixture of respect and something else she couldn't place. Zarya felt a strange pull in her chest, an urge to ask him about the look in his eyes. But she didn't. It was foolish, even dangerous, to dwell on feelings that didn't belong in her world. She was a princess, and she had a duty to her people. The idea of something more, something personal, was a luxury she couldn't afford. As they continued the tour, Zarya found herself thinking more and more about Eric. There was no denying the subtle connection she felt with him, though she pushed it aside. She had her future to think about. She had Lord Arvin waiting for her, an alliance to uphold, and an empire to lead. There was no room for distractions. But even as she tried to convince herself of that, a small part of her wondered, what if there was more to life than duty? What if, in the vastness of space, there was room for something else, something real? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. There was no place for such notions in her life. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. But as she glanced at Eric once more, she couldn't help but wonder what might have been. The days following Zarya's arrival on Earth were filled with preparations for the upcoming marriage ceremony. Her schedule was packed with meetings, appearances, and discussions about the political significance of her union with Lord Arvin. There was little room for anything personal, and that suited Zarya just fine. She had always known her duty, and now she was living it. The weight of her role as the princess of the Marvok Empire was heavy, but it was one she had accepted long ago. Still, in the back of her mind, there lingered thoughts about Eric. The mechanic, who had been nothing more than a background figure in her life, had somehow managed to occupy her thoughts more than she was comfortable with. Every time she saw him, she couldn't help but notice the way his eyes met hers with quiet understanding, as if he saw something in her that no one else did. It made her uneasy, especially because she knew she could never act on such feelings. The day of the marriage ceremony arrived quickly. Zarya stood before the full-length mirror in her chambers, adjusting the delicate fabric of her gown. The dress, a luxurious blend of silver and blue, was designed to reflect her royal status, and it shimmered under the light. Her hair was styled in intricate braids, adorned with precious stones that sparkled like the stars. She was the picture of elegance, the perfect image of a future empress. But as she looked at her reflection, Zarya couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Her heart felt heavy, and the smile she saw in the mirror looked forced. She had spent so much of her life preparing for this moment, yet now that it had arrived, she felt strangely hollow. "Your Highness, the ceremony will begin shortly." A servant's voice interrupted her thoughts. Zarya nodded, though she barely heard the servant's words. She was lost in her own thoughts, wondering what the future would hold. Would she ever find happiness in this life, Or was she destined to spend it alone, surrounded by power but devoid of love? As she made her way to the ceremony hall, Zarya's mind wandered back to Arik. She hadn't seen him since their last conversation. He had been busy with the final preparations for the ship's departure, ensuring everything was ready for the journey. Their brief moments together seemed like distant memories, yet they had stayed with her in a way she couldn't explain. When Zarya entered the ceremony hall, her eyes immediately found Lord Arvin. He was standing near the front, waiting for her, looking every bit the part of the powerful noble he was. He smiled when he saw her, his expression warm and confident. "Princess Zarya," he greeted her, his voice smooth and practiced. "You look as radiant as ever." Zarya offered a polite smile in return. "Thank you, Lord Arvin."
You're too kind. The ceremony began, and Zarya went through the motions.
The words of the priest sounded distant, like they were coming from far away. She tried to focus, to pay attention, but her mind kept drifting. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her thoughts returned to Arik once more. What would he think of this? Would he be disappointed to see her marrying someone she didn't truly love? The thought of him brought a tightness to her chest, a feeling that she couldn't explain. She had never allowed herself to think about love or relationships, at least not in the way other people did. Her life had been defined by duty, by the need to secure the future of her empire. But now, standing before Lord Arvin, Zarya realized just how much she had sacrificed in the name of duty. She had never allowed herself to imagine a life outside of the Empire's expectations. She had never considered what her own desires might be. The priest's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Do you, Zarya, take Lord Arvin to be your husband, to love and honor him for all your days?" Zarya froze. The words felt foreign, almost like they didn't belong to her. She knew the answer, of course. She had known it for years. But as she stood there, staring at Lord Arvin, she found herself unable to speak. A moment of silence passed before Lord Arvin gently placed a hand on her shoulder, breaking the stillness. "Zarya," he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Are you well?" Zarya blinked, her gaze shifting to him. She forced a smile, though it felt strained.
Yes, of course.
"I apologize. I am fine." The ceremony continued, but Zarya could barely focus. Her heart was racing, and her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was here, in this moment, with a man she didn't love, about to make a commitment that she wasn't sure she could honor. When it was finally time to exchange vows, Zarya felt like she was moving through a dream. The words she spoke felt hollow, as though they had no meaning. And when Lord Arvin placed a ring on her finger, she didn't feel the joy or the excitement that she thought she should. Instead, she felt a sense of dread settle over her. The ceremony ended, and the guests began to applaud. But Zarya's thoughts were far away. She found herself searching for something, or someone, in the crowd, but it was difficult to focus. It was then that she caught sight of Arik. He was standing near the back of the room, his gaze fixed on her. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the noise of the room faded into nothing. There was a depth in his eyes that Zarya hadn't noticed before, something that made her feel seen in a way she never had with anyone else. But before she could move, Lord Arvin's hand gently took hers, pulling her away from her thoughts. "Shall we greet our guests, my dear?" he asked, his voice full of enthusiasm. Zarya nodded, forcing herself to smile. She couldn't focus on Arik now, not in front of so many people. She had made her choice, and it was time to live with it. As the evening went on, Zarya couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She smiled and chatted with her guests, but the smile never reached her eyes. Her thoughts kept drifting to Arik, to the quiet mechanic who had somehow captured her attention without even trying. Why did she keep thinking about him? She had never allowed herself to indulge in such feelings. But now, as she stood beside Lord Arvin, she realized that it was too late to change anything. The path had already been set, and there was no turning back. Later that night, after the guests had left and the celebrations had died down, Zarya found herself alone in her chambers. She stood in front of the mirror again, staring at her reflection. The gown she wore was now heavy with the weight of her thoughts. She removed the veil and let it fall to the floor, her hands trembling slightly as she brushed her hair from her face. She wasn't sure what she was searching for. Perhaps some answer, some clarity about her feelings. But all she found was the same emptiness that had followed her for so long. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. "Princess?" Arek's voice came from the other side. Zarya's heart skipped a beat. She took a deep breath before answering.
Come in. The door opened and Arek stepped inside. He was still wearing his mechanic uniform, his hands dirty from hours of work.
He looked out of place in the opulent room, but Zarya didn't mind. She was grateful for the familiarity he brought. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Eric said quietly. "I just wanted to check on you." Zarya forced a smile.
No, not at all. I'm just.
Thinking. Arik nodded, his eyes searching hers.
I understand.
"It's a big day." Zarya looked at him, and for the first time in a long while she felt something stir inside her. A connection that was undeniable. She wanted to say something, to tell him how she felt, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded. "Thank you, Eric." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a soft sigh, Arik turned to leave. "I'll be around if you need anything," he said over his shoulder. Zarya watched him go, her heart heavy with emotions she couldn't name. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she realized something. She had spent so long running from her own desires, from the possibility of love, that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly live. And now, standing in the quiet of her chambers, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again.